Welcome to another episode of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, episode 35, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In episode 34, we talked about what businesses could do to target and be found by domestic companies looking for suppliers in the U.S. to minimize their tariff exposure. Today's episode is about companies' decisions to have a multilingual site or a multinational site. We're going to talk about the key choices and the reasons that should be considered before making this decision. Hey, Bill, how's it going?
Doing well. And yourself?
Good. Yeah, I thought this was a good topic. I saw a bunch of different people asking questions and running into decisions after launching websites about how to set this up. And you've got a lot of experience with this, and I'm actually in the process of finishing up an article on this topic. So I thought this would be a good one for today. Can you describe to everybody the differences between the two?
Yeah, I mean, really simply, companies need to make a decision when they're going international or outside of their home market. And if we talk about it on the website, there's two approaches. There's language only, meaning let's say you're going to go to the UK. Well, you can just, clone your US English site into English and obviously make all the adjustments for the UK. It's going to be currency. There are some language differences, taxes, all that stuff. So obviously most people know to do that. But the question is, do we simply spin out or clone our English language site for the UK? Or do we make changes to the site, the existing site to accommodate both market elements? Or do we truly create, multi-regional or multi-market sites? So for example, I'm going to create a UK one, then we're going to go out with German. So do we now make that a German site, German language site, which does say triple duty for Switzerland and Austria as well as Germany? Or do we then say, well, no, there's whatever reason, we will talk about the reason you choose, or do we create one for each, or we just simply have a German language website? And I think there's a lot of people struggling with this because one thing they're seeing some multinationals, I mean, IBM is probably one of the more prominent, but I know of probably another half dozen big companies that are in this process of moving from market specific, where they've got 100 plus market specific. So, one for Japan and France and Germany, and deciding that, hey, we're just going to have 10 to 12 language only, meaning, and this is what companies like Skype and often a lot of software companies tend to do, that because there's not often real differences that they need to deal with between language and market sites. And that's really what it is. A market site is specific for that market. Everything sort of speaks to it being for the United Kingdom or for Germany, whereas language is just all about getting the language right and then using some modern technology to integrate things that may be needed when you're dealing with anything market specific.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a couple questions you need to ask. Like, who's your primary audience? Is it, just different languages or different countries or both? Are you trying to reach people who speak various languages? Or are you trying to target customers in specific countries with unique needs? This, goes to products and services. Are your products and services the same everywhere, or do they need to be localized by region? I think, there are newer technologies now that will allow you to have language version sites, and then you can pull in different products. But, today I think most companies that have multi-regional sites have different products in the different regions, and so they need to be localized.
And that's one of the key considerations. So I wrote an article. It's part of a series that we've been working on around sort of this. It started with the rant, essentially, why are we still, in 2000, with most of our technology and most of our strategy and thinking. And I think one of the reasons is that a lot of, the people with the gray hair that are being brought into to champion this, especially with a lot of startups in some cases. This is the way they've always done it. And I think we'll talk about on a future episode how some more agile companies are doing this. And I think as people are making, so there was two objectives for this podcast specifically. One is to talk about this multilingual versus multi-regional, and then go through one, point number one, which is what you just talked about. The product set is the decision tree. So in the follow-on article to that rant, I think it's 22 different points in a decision tree. Took me back to when I was working on the mode of entry model when I was in my undergraduate many, many years, 30 some years ago, where, it was all the different ways to enter a market. And I think it was just short of 1,000 questions or answers you had to make, everything from culture to electricity to temperature to transportation, tariffs, all of that. And I think that's not the purpose of this, but we have similar things we have to talk about. So, we discussed what is language centric or what is market centric approach. I think the next thing we really have to address, really that old school go to market model, because, and this is a thing we both encountered so many times. And with hreflang Builder, I'd say 2 or 3 a week, somebody would come to me and they'd have typically travel, right? They're either like an aggregator, a booking aggregator, or affiliate aggregator, or they had information related to travel, and it didn't matter where people came from because they had, Stripe or something that they could take payments from anybody in the world. And they would say, "Hey, I have this English site and I'm not doing well in these other English markets, or especially UK and Australia. And this SEO told me that I needed to have an Australian or a UK site. And so I want to clone it, but Google thinks it's duplicate. So let me use hreflang to tell it it's not." And it's like, well, technically it's still a duplicate. What have you done to make it for the UK? What have you done to make it for Australia? Didn't even have pricing adjusted. Just had a click here to buy. And then when his argument was his system could do it. So this idea for online only, and this is a key, a multilingual may be that single English, that single German, that single French may be sufficient. Obviously you've got to localize it. And there's so many, and they're more advanced now. I think, you were mentioning like Shopify. You can clone Shopify, and then, it has a level of detection that if somebody is coming in from, say, Germany, then, okay, it knows to change the pricing to euro. It's going to insert, taxing information or any jurisdictional information based on Germany, because that's the IP of the visitor, et cetera, et cetera. So again, that can definitely work. And that's where I think we're going. And we'll talk about in a future episode is, how we should be thinking about these. So again, if you're online only, it's there. The other is partners. If you've got a site and then you did a deal with somebody in, I don't know, the one that always comes to mind is the Middle East. People always doing deals with rich folks in the Middle East where they come in, they license your brand, they license your site. But most people don't think to put any constraints. Like when I tell everybody, have at least something around Search Console, centralizing Search Console where you can have hreflang. Anyways, a whole host of things we could talk about related to partners, but the partner site in many cases is not your site. And you may not be able to control what they do. And then the legal agreements you have, especially if you're licensing someone else's. I've seen people get caught up in this. They'll license something and then think because they have that license, they can go to multiple markets. They just clone their website when there might be strict rules. So again, before you even decide which way to go, do you have any of these? I mean, if you have a wholly owned subsidiary, that's a whole different story. Now, having a physical presence in a market opens you up to a whole host of regulatory compliance requirements. The fact that you're physically a company in another market, and even if you're not, there's a whole set of law that's around, you doing things to sell to another market
Yeah.
may put you on the hook,
Yeah. Yeah, legally,
for doing that.
you're intentionally selling into a market that
Exactly.
you should know the market.
And something as simple as, and when I was doing my international law courses, something as simple as you going to a trade show and actively seeking out customers, and then sending them sample products. The sheer fact of that you went there, you've now, basically from a legal standpoint, crossed into, I totally spaced the legal term for this, but you've moved into that. You've effectively targeted that market. And there's a whole ton of international case law where people have been sued. Your product breaks. And it's like, well, I sold it to them. But the fact that you went there and actively traded in that market holds you liable, especially from a product liability standpoint. The other one I see, decision you got to make is when you're doing a marketplace strategy like Rakuten, Amazon, Mercado Libre. They're essentially the brand hub, and you're, sending it to their warehouse, and then they stock it and drop ship it for you. So that's an interesting thing. You can't do much about marketing those websites other than using social media to promote it. Obviously, you can feed in your product feeds and optimize product feeds, but these are things you need to consider. And so I think there's that. You've really got to think about how are we structured, and those sort of legal, elements, especially when you're going into this, because countries like China require you to be registered if you've got a website in Chinese in China. If you're on a CDN because somebody told you, the moment you host in China, they won't actually host you until you've been registered in China. So, you may have to use a CDN elsewhere. And we know that Baidu tends to favor websites hosted in China because, what they need to do to crawl that. In Japan, you've got to list all your country details. In many markets, the reason countries actually don't register CCTLDs is you have to have an officer or a designated person in that country. And so you try to register a .co.jp as opposed to a .jp. The fact that it's a .co.jp, you have to have a person that effectively can go to jail for you
Well,
if you do something wrong. And this is why a lot of companies, in this stepping back again, let's take it back to early days. One of the number one reasons many companies didn't go with CCTLDs wasn't necessarily the expense, but it was the legal requirement to be registered or have a person registered in that country. Many of those rules have been softened, but many still have it. Japan still has it, and China has it. And I don't remember all of them that still have that requirement. But when you go to try to register the domain and they tell you who is the officer in that country, that's a pretty good indicator that you need somebody physically there. And they don't have some of the services we have in the States where, you can set up an LLC under a trade name, and, you're going to have to physically have someone, like I said, who can go to jail on your behalf if you screw something up.
I
And so
know,
that, go ahead.
I know you could get in trouble if you've set up your href lang wrong, where you're designating a dark market, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's the same legal requirement. And then it's
implicit.
dealing with jurisdiction. So exactly that. So in href-lang, because you've purposeful availment, there it goes. So I got tease the word out. So the
Mhm.
legal term is purposeful availment. And what you've done, let's say taken your website and you said, hey, this Arabic version is specifically for the UAE or for Saudi Arabia. A dark market is somewhere you can't sell your product. Like in this, if you sell alcohol, you can't actively market or sell. Pharma is another one. But if somebody takes, if they're trying to do a regional href-lang strategy and they say, hey, this Arabic language site is our UAE website, is our Saudi Arabia, is our Egypt. The moment you've set that, you've purposely stated through the virtue of that tag, that website is targeting those markets. And through the legal concept of purposeful availment, you've said this website is for that market, and we're doing this so that website can be seen in that market. Just like when you've, went to the conference and you were, handing out your brochures like candy and trying to do deals and signing deals. It's the same thing. And from a legal standpoint, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've studied this enough and have taken enough international law and international contract courses to know that this is that area that will ding you. And so, like you said, somebody that think they're doing you a favor is not doing you a favor by setting the hreflang region like that. I've not seen anybody yet use this, but I don't think anybody, and I've not went out and said, hey, lawyers, here's a cool thing for you to use. But talking it to my law professors, especially on the international side, they thought this was pretty interesting. And I think that's lawyer code for I'm going to use this when I need to. But again, it goes back to that legal structure, organizational structure. What are you trying to do? Other things that fall into this category. And basically, when I pasted that into my notes, I broke some of my other things. Well, the very number one thing that I had on my list for companies when they're making the decision, Bill, is what you brought up, products. And through, a little more time than I needed to spend on it, I came up with the magical number of 20 to 30%. If 20 to 30% of your product set is different between markets, you may want to have a market centric website.
Yeah,
if you
I
just
think
have two or
there's a
three.
lot of little nuanced things like, if you're truly international and you're planning just to go to a language site, their countries have different localization, like Quebec French and Mexico versus Spain for Spanish. Depending on the services and what you're selling, you might actually turn someone off if they're reading language in their own language, but it's not localized.
Exactly. And I think that's, as we go through some of these key points, I think that's a key one to remember, because again, I've seen this time and time again, especially with Spanish, where I think there's 32 or 36. One stat I remember was 22. I think 22 in Latin America. And yes, it's Spanish, but I tell you exactly what my son experienced was, I think 6 years or 8 years or maybe even more Spanish. And then he went to do his internship in Spain. And the first thing they told him is, dude, we need to send you to language courses to learn business Spanish, Spain Spanish. And
Oh,
then
wow.
he was load balancing between Madrid and Barcelona. So a couple days a week, he was up in the Barcelona office, and they're like, dude, we need to teach you Barcelona Spanish. And so, it's interesting because when he was offered a job, a really, really good job at a multinational to go to Argentina to be a key part of their web team, he's like, hell no, I'm not going to go through that Spanish thing again. And so that's exactly it. And I think, Bill, your point is, we can. And what I used to tell people was back in the day, that model I worked on was 10 categories with 1,000 questions. And the output of that, so my job was to create the weighting and then the database logic that would output basically, a recommendation for where you should go. And that's what I'm building into this worksheet, by the way, is some level of that recommendations to say, plug in these variables. And the key was back in the day before we had this thing called the internet, you had to partner with somebody, or you had to set up a factory, or you had to set up a store. You could put up, fill up, a couple suitcases of your stuff and, walk around the boardwalk and name your country or city and sell it. Fine, you can do that. But if you're a proper company, you then had to mail that to people, in which case you had to deal with tariffs and taxes and all these things. And so, but now this thing, the interweb, the fact that and I've heard this 10,000 times from people. Hey, I have a Spanish language site, or I have a French language site. And I can point to at least 10 large e-commerce companies that have this same opinion. It's like, I had one say, look, we localized this into 50 languages, and I'm going to use every damn one of them.
Hmm.
And so they spun out versions of their website with simply, here, or one that's still live today, has the top 5 languages for every market in the world, and it created like 50 million pages. And I
Oh
joke
my
about
God.
this where
So
they had one.
for every country,
They
they had five
Yep,
languages?
yep, 5 languages. So
Oh
they
my God.
had Spanish for Papua New Guinea, right? In every island in why? Because you can, right? Think about this. We could take a list of all the countries, and we can basically build out if we have the country code
Yeah.
and we have a language code and we have a really good mash it up for an output person, code, we can basically, and that's what they did. They took every country code and made a folder, and in the 5 languages and made a folder. And then basically, if it was French, then that Papua New Guinea website or folder was populated with French. And this was like, I think they were 100,000 SKUs or 10,000 SKUs. But, anyways, it ended up being close to 50 million pages, and wanted to know why they weren't being crawled, and wanted to know why, I don't know, whatever's page was outranking the UK in the UK. And it's like, well, because Google found that one first. And well, let's use hreflang to fix this. And there was nothing materially different between, these however many hundreds of versions of English and Spanish and French and German and Chinese and Japanese. And there was nothing I could say to tell them this, until Google started saying, I don't need all this crap. Then in the end, what they decided to do is fine. We're going to have the core languages, but people can pick it and select it. And it's like, go ahead, do that, and then you can bring in scripts that, like you said, modify to inject the French Canadian versus France French or Moroccan French or whatever derivative or regional variation of French that you need to. And I think that's key. And so, we can't just look at the web as a way for us to do a quick merge and chuck it out on the web and let Google sort it out. Those days are done. And I
Yeah.
think, there's a lot of people sort of conspiracy theorying right now with Google's slowdown, this apparent May update where Google's not crawling a lot of what they were crawling. And I don't think that's a function of any conspiracies. Is Google's like, fine, we don't need this bullshit anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that across most of my clients as well. One increased, but the others, it slowed down. And, honestly, how many pages change?
Right.
Yeah, I haven't
And it was
dug
like a stat
into the reason, but yeah, go ahead.
It was like a stat we talked about not long ago that Cloudflare put out something. It's in my rant about why people aren't being indexed. And I think they said 55 or 65% of every page Google was fetching as it was coming through Cloudflare had no material change. So it hadn't been changed since the last time they fetched it. But
Yeah.
because, they were like a kid at a buffet, they would take anything and everything that they could find. Now I think because of so much stuff is out there. And this is what Fabrice talks about with the frontier land, all the undiscovered content that
Mm.
is potentially brilliant, but we can't get to it because of the overhead of recrawling the stuff. And this is the whole premise behind Index Now, is that you could send that signal to tell them that there's been a material update. Anyways, these are, we've sort of jumped into the problem set of whichever decision you talk about, because Bill, you're exactly right. It creates every version, whether it be language or market and language, creates an exponential increase. Then we get into the next problem, since we're in problems. It's what we've been talking about, and it's sort of the service that we started offering recently is around geo-targeting. Because if you've got an English page and you've launched it in 40 markets and the only thing that changed is the currency symbol, there's no geographic signal. And then the first thing I get is, well, I've got a pound symbol. And why can't Google see the pound symbol to know? And I've got hreflang in place. Even with hreflang, why do they need that?
Yeah.
Right? You've said it's there, but you've not done anything to make it unique to that market. And it's like, but that's hard. That's a lot of work. Well, imagine if you had to do a physical store. how
Right.
hard and expensive that would be. So, I never have been sympathetic, to the excuses of wanting to just bulk push it out there. And so that was, one of the reasons I think that we've been trying to break this down. The geo-targeting thing for the audience, Bill and I started breaking this down because we were looking for, and we went down this sort of tract when Google changed their domain, basically recalled everything back to the mothership on google.com. And there was some other changes where the search marketplace and international consultants were saying, hey, Google no longer has a need for it. So magically they made the leap from Google moved to google.com to hreflang is not needed anymore because Google obviously can figure it out. Hey, for those that don't know, Google sucked at hreflang. And
Yeah.
Google sucked at being found. Like I have dozens of screenshots from conferences where I did a search for, Google Argentina and Google Uruguay comes up, or in looking for Google, Peru and Chile shows up. Google Chile. I mean, it's right there. I just told you what I wanted. How hard was it to hardwire that? So them doing, again, we getting off on a tangent. I got to stop doing that. But we started going down this road of geo-targeting signals and how to integrate them on the off chance that Google may sunset hreflang.
Yeah.
They haven't. They've no talk about doing that. They've been talking about actually creating it, enhancing it exponentially. But in doing this, we found that many companies aren't doing any kind of geo-targeting.
Right. And I'll bet that there's a majority of companies who, like you described earlier, are just trying to expand into other markets without anything but a website. And if that's all you have, you don't have any signals to put down. Like you don't have a
Exactly.
local phone number, you don't have a local office to visit. And I don't mean, I keep saying this. I guess we're lucky we live in the US. We have access to almost everything and anything we want. But if I were in another country and I found something in my local language and it was from the US, I probably would keep looking.
Trying to find something in your market
Yeah,
because a
exactly.
whole host of
Exactly.
things, right?
Give me some trust signals, you know?
You trust, yeah, they're actually going to deliver it,
Right,
right?
right.
You would think that if it's somebody,
And now
maybe
tariffs.
definitely in your city, but definitely in your country,
Yeah,
the tariff one,
yeah,
that's a great point. I need to write that because we're old enough to be back in the days when, in the early days of FedEx and UPS,
Oh my God. Oh, what the
you
nightmare.
would order something and then from another country, and then the UPS guy would come up and said, yeah, it's $45 for the tariff.
Right.
I'm like, what do you mean it's $45? It's a $4 item. And then you got gouged on shipping.
Yeah.
And so it's like, my God, I've paid 10 times. And to your point, I couldn't find it in my country. So I was willing to pay a premium to have it shipped to me. And then because it triggered some item category, I got hit with a tariff. I'll give you a quick story. My first company was Quake Gear, and we made earthquake kits. And I got an order. The whole reason I'm in search today was because of that order. It was many millions selling these kits to a large department store that was going to sell them all across Japan. When we sent the first set of samples to them, they got held in customs because we, on our inventory of the kit, so we had to say it's a kit, and because the kit is multiple components, we had to have an itemized list of all the components attached to the manifest. And one line item was an empty plastic bottle. And the recommendation was take whatever medication you're taking and put at least a couple days supply in this plastic.
Hmm.
Do you know what we called that bottle on the inventory list?
Medicine
Pill bottle.
pill bottle. Okay. Yeah.
There was no pills. It was an empty plastic container. But the fact that we called it pill bottle, even though it was empty and there's no pharmaceutical connection, the word pill immediately put that item into a pharmaceutical category, and in which case they wanted us to provide a pharmaceutical sales license and all this other crazy shit.
Oh
I'm like,
wow.
just take them out. We ended up taking it out, and simply leaving the recommendation, hey, find a Ziploc bag or whatever and put some medicine in it. And that's how crazy it is and what it was. Now, if you try to ship something, these shippers have all kinds of checklists and stuff. What kind of products? What's the components? AI can actually check your inventory list and flag all of this.
Mm.
But these are the things people are still afraid of. Is that whole and the tariffs now? I mean, the whole de minimis, restriction where you could buy something under, $300 or $800, you didn't pay a tariff is gone in the
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah.
So even if you buy something that's 50 cents, you're going to pay a tariff on it before it got waived. And this is why some of these companies are getting hammered because, the little widget and Chotsky that they were selling at Etsy or wherever, it's not working. So again, that was a second point, after your product set, are there any of the variances that Bill, you talked about, seasonal variations, between people in the northern and southern hemisphere, right? If you're selling, and again, it's how you structure the website, right? If
Yeah.
it's, we have the second hottest day of the year so far here in Connecticut, which is why we're both sweating because we're too cheap to turn on air conditioning this early. But in other parts of the world, it's winter. And so they want to see, parkas and puffy jackets and sweaters.
Yeah.
And now we want to see, things like shorts and tank tops and swimsuits. So
Yeah.
that's another reason you may need it if you don't have an automated way to switch that. But regulatory, again, the safety issues, product approvals, licensing requirements, import export restrictions, all those are issues. Another thing we run into in your decision is supply chain and logistics. Again, that was a big category in the model I worked on as an undergrad, but I didn't really understand the modern implications until I really was doing a lot of hreflang for global e-commerce companies. And one thing that we ran into a lot was product SKUs, product sizes, product naming conventions. SKUs was crazy. A lot of companies will have a SKU, a product ID, a product number, that barcode thing
Yeah.
for the product. And every country, most regions, let's talk about regions in this case. The EU has a different standard than the US and et cetera. So you need to do that. And so because of that, people would often have a different SKU on the website. It was fascinating how many that the SKU deviated, not because it was a different plug for electrical items, but where they sourced it. And so somebody, they might have 50 market website. They would have 50 different SKUs to reflect the different nuance or product IDs based on things like the IKEA, their Billy bookcase. It's called the Billy bookcase and it's got the Swedish name for it in, 100 plus countries, but every one of them has a different SKU. And so I'm about to publish an article to say if you do one thing before you launch your first market website is create a global product ID. And any time that same product, even with all of its crazy nuances, if it's the same name, if it's virtually the same product, if it's the Billy bookcase, then create a column for that ID so that we can pair it later, either for analytics, for hreflang, or whatever. You can pair it. So again, getting back to language or market, if you've got local sourcing requirements, shipping restrictions, inventory management complexity, if you're like one of the 99.9% of e-commerce companies that use one CMS in the US and use another one in Europe and yet another one, or those that are on Shopify and for legal and economic reasons, you have to create different hubs is what they'll typically call it. You've got a Euro hub for people in the European Union, and that you've got everything catered to EU, and then you've got North America, which depending on how things happen with the NAFTA or whatever the latest Trump's version of NAFTA is, we may not have a North American component anymore because now with tariffs and licensing and all that could be changed. And then we've got Australia, and then we got an ASEAN. So all this could be different CMSs. And that's another thing we could probably put up at the top. It's, technically, how are you going to go and how are you going to stay there? So supply chain, web infrastructure are other key things that dictate which of these you go to. Now, a lot of this is simplified if you're just selling information or if you're selling
Yeah.
software that's downloadable.
Yeah.
If you don't have physical products, this gets dramatically simplified as opposed to having products, having a physical presence. I've heard that potentially having your stuff in a marketplace warehouse like Amazon may actually put you into a local host, a local jurisdiction as well. I've not seen any outcome of international law on that, but
What is that? Say that again.
it's like if you send your stuff, a container of your product to have in Mercado Libre's
Oh.
warehouse in Mexico or in Argentina, the fact that it's your product and in their warehouse, there may be some jurisdiction issues.
Oh boy.
They've effectively bought it from you, but it's
Hmm.
still, and it's interesting as we start to look into liability. Not every country sues like the US. If you get a paper cut when you open the box, there'll be people who sue over the paper cut. But it's not as prevalent in other markets, but clearly, if you buy something that's got a lithium battery and it burns down your house, they're going to come to you,
Mm.
and then you got to sue the lithium battery maker. But anyways, it's just things like that you have to.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group.
Some other things we had on the list that actually have not only a local website versus language was sort of the e-commerce pivots, around sizing. If you're selling stuff, there's like, and I did a rant on this a while back where, people bury size charts in their support content. And, why can't I have, if it's nothing else than stupidity and my laziness, let me put in my country or put in my size from my country and tell me what it is in the market, right? Like many shoes, you flip back the tongue of the shoe and it's got like 8 sizes
Yeah,
in
UK,
there.
US.
Why can't we have a widget for that? Why does it have to be a table?
Mm.
Where I have to do the mental math and then or you have things where it's in centimeters and millimeters
Yeah.
and again, well, America is the only market that has, these sort of the system we have, the standard system and not the metric system,
We're the
but
problem.
we're the problem.
Have
But
you ever ordered anything off of Amazon and it comes in and it's like made for a toddler? It's like,
exactly, because the size is wonky. Or I love the disclaimer, like I put in the rant in my disclaimer, the disclaimer section of the size chart was longer than the instructions on how to use the size chart. That said exactly that. The way it was sewn for a market may be sewn differently for a market. The fabric, I mean, it was like everything you could think of. The fact that, you know, it was modeled on a skinny person and you may not be the same. That's why a lot of things will tell you, like Columbia, I love it when they have that this is a 6'2" model with this, this chest and inseam.
hmm,
So when you see how it fits on that person, you're like, well, shit, I'm not 6'2" with that inseam or waist size. So yeah, it's probably, again, any sane person would probably, but
right,
again,
right.
it's there for a reason. And so, thinking of that, in each of these, again, in e-commerce, points, cultural nuance, and this is a whole nother one, local preference versus demand. Again, sizing. Have you accommodated for them? Have you put it in the right size? And things like that. You mentioned wording nuances. I mean, that's always an interesting thing, how people, search for it. And my wife has, I don't know, a few hundred examples she uses at conferences where she talks about the arguments she's had with clients on, hey, we want to call it this. And basically they need to get with the program.
Yeah,
It's like, no, actually, they don't need to get with the program. You need to adapt to them if you want to sell to them. If they're calling it this, then you need to reference it as that,
right.
or at least be adjacent to it. I think that's another one that we run into. Um, We talked about legal and regulatory pricing.
I,
How are we going to accommodate with price?
yeah, go ahead and finish that thought.
Again, if you're using Shopify or Salesforce Commerce Cloud or any of the pure global enterprise tool, most of them have some logic built in where you can dynamically change prices. The challenge, one of the things you see in every annual report from an e-commerce company, after now the Google warning statement and then the tariff statement is the currency fluctuation statement. The dollar is all over the place. The yen is fluctuating all over the place. The pound sterling is fluctuating all over the place. So, a lot of people are struggling with, how, if dynamic pricing is based on some currency conversion variable of your home market price, you're open to that fluctuation unless it's semi real
Oh,
time,
yeah,
right? So if the dollar drops today and it's adjusted, it could go up 8 to 12% in a given day. And people are like, well,
yeah.
that's more than it was the other day. So again, these dynamic pricing things to deal with that. So anyways, these are things that you have to think about. How do you adapt this? There was just one or two more, the trust signals,
Yeah,
huge.
we're running a little long. I want to finish up with I guess you call it organizational structure because we talk a lot about the language versions, but I think there should be some minimal requirements for a lot of different national sites, and I also think there's some good reasons for it. And so I want to talk about this for a couple minutes.
Yeah.
One of the things I see companies struggling with is when they have a non-regional structure and there are local marketing teams that want to make changes. First, kudos for them to have a local marketing team. So I would say it's almost necessary if you're going to put in a regional site structure that there is someone dedicated, maybe not from the region, but dedicated for that market. Because if there isn't, there's almost no reason to have it unless it's just a product structure, which we talked about having dynamic pricing and things like
Right.
that. Have you seen any interesting ways people have dealt with regional marketing teams trying to work within a language site?
Yeah. I think one is, what did they need that they can't get from the core site? This is the argument I always get. We need our own market site because we need stuff on it, our stuff on it. And when you pin them down and like, what's our stuff? And it's typically things like marketing events, campaigns. And obviously, we're not even don't even need to talk about the fact that they want the description and all that stuff to be right. That's a given.
Hmm.
But a lot of times when you pin them down, they just needed a place to put that stuff. And
Yeah.
if one market needs it, everybody needs it. And so you need to accommodate that piece of it. But there's actually a really good article that I wrote based on one of my grad school professors about this decision tree and how to blend this hybrid that people can check out. We'll link to it. But I think one is, what are their needs? What do you want them to do? What can they edit themselves, especially on the language side? An interesting thing I'm starting to see is companies that have like a high end or an expensive CMS using a smaller CMS. So I'll give you a good example. So Milestone Internet, their CMS is designed for multi-tenant. And what they've been doing is actually licensing their CMS where significantly more economically, they can have all of your regional marketing managers can have access to it. And then it uses the API with like an AEM or a Commerce Cloud to where they can go in and edit things within a certain framework, like descriptions and stuff like that.
Okay.
They
So
edit it in the low end CMS where they have rights and restrictions. And then through the API to the big CMS, it pushes that content.
interesting.
And so it's an interesting way to deal with this where it does give the local market a level of autonomy within gated parameters, but it also reduces the expense of them having to pay, $100,000 for a license for a market that, it's a fractional person. It's 1/100th of their day or
Yeah.
week editing this content. So
Right.
that's
Right.
one way. And I think for market people, I love the idea of having someone, at least at HQ, that's empathetic and sympathetic and collaborative with these teams to try to accommodate them.
Right.
I think another really big issue with this is when you do releases. We see a lot of times when you do a release, the English in some cases will overwrite the local market or seriously degrade the local market.
Wow.
Or the other big one is they'll actually spin out an English version for which that's non-existent, treating the localized version as a child rather than a parent page, which it may be in your CMS. So that's a great point. People need to think about what needs to be done in the market, what should they do, what can they do, and more importantly, how can we make the site in whatever fragmented way that you deploy it accommodate what they need. And in the article, I talk about some hybrid decision frameworks that are similar to that. That some markets, you may go with market, some may go with market and language. Some may be, we can send them back to the global market site, whatever. But go through all these decisions and think about that. Be aware that the local teams are there to do their job, to hit their KPIs, and we got to be accommodating for them.
Yeah, and if you're not, they use that as an excuse when you find their campaign website that they didn't tell anybody about.
I mean, they got KPIs. At the end of the day, they have KPIs like you, and you're either you're either in the way and hindering them, and so they're going to go to Plan B and spin out a campaign site or a parallel site, and they're going to make it happen with or without you. So the best thing is to loop it in. And the key, I think one of the key things we're trying to give you as a takeaway in this episode is let's do this as far up front in the cycle as we possibly can.
Yeah.
So that we've had a lot of these grown up decisions. We're accommodating to the market. We're understanding of the market. What can we repurpose to give us scale, speed to market and then what do we truly need to get from that local market? And in that article that my professor and his associates wrote, they call it the dual pillars of growth, thinking both about scalability as well as the needs of all the uniqueness of the local market.
Yeah, that's good. So, it's not an easy thing. Sometimes it's a business decision, but this is why you and I are really focused on doing audits with web value creation. I see companies that have 50% of their markets untouched, or it's just translate and push it out there. Like they're getting traffic from the market, but is there really a value in that?
And what are you doing with that traffic?
Exactly. So any final words?
No, I think just go through the checklist, check out Bill's new article about this, is expanding on this idea. Use the framework, look at the framework. And again, whether you're just launching your first market or it's your 51st market, think about these things for every new market you launch, and then how can you realign against existing markets? And again, I think Bill nailed it with how do you, get strategic value out of these precious assets and make them work exponentially harder for you.
Right. Thanks. We really hope you're finding value in our conversations. If you're enjoying the show, we'd appreciate it if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. We also want to hear from you. Your feedback helps motivate us to keep making these things. Follow International Web Mastery on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. And till next time, take care.
See you.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.